Your digital privacy is still top of mind, even in the middle of this pandemic, and Silent Pocket just made it easier for you to up your privacy game by offering 3 of their most popular products in one easy-to-purchase Privacy Starter Kit. Silent Pocket's Privacy Starter Kit includes a black nylon medium-sized Faraday sleeve for your smartphone, a flexible key fob guard, and privacy stickers for your laptop and smartphone. This is everything you need to give yourself or a friend or family member instant protection for their digital lives. Pick up your Privacy Starter Kit today by visiting sharedsecurity.net/privacykit, and don't forget to use discount code SHAREDSECURITY to take 15% off your order.
Over 90% of individuals show risky behavior in handling potential phishing messages, according to ClickArmor's free CanIBeFished.com self-assessment. This engaging coronavirus edition of CanIBeFished.com can help identify your team's total vulnerability to phishing attacks that exploit the pandemic situation. So test your own vulnerability to phishing attacks for free now at CanIBeFished.com.
Joining me today to talk about a future without passwords is Andrew Shikiar, Executive Director at the FIDO Alliance. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. So can you talk a little bit about your background and maybe a little bit about who the FIDO Alliance is?
Yeah, sure. So again, I'm Andrew Shikiar. I'm the Executive Director and CMO at FIDO Alliance. I've been in digital identity for almost 20 years now, which is scary to say.
Long time.
Yeah, right. And I joined FIDO Alliance itself in 2016 to help lead its marketing efforts. And I now serve as a CMO and a co-executive director. So there's 2 of us who help lead the organization. FIDO itself was launched in 2013 with the aim of addressing the plague of data breaches, and in doing so, the password problem. Passwords are very much the tip of the spear of the data breach problem. And it's something that FIDO's founders and the founding organizations felt like would be the best thing to address to help stop data breaches in their tracks. FIDO itself is comprised today of around 250 companies worldwide that broadly fit into 3 categories. The first category are the device manufacturers and platform providers, people who are creating the platforms and devices we use every day. So companies like Microsoft, Google, Apple, Samsung, chipset guys like Intel and Qualcomm. That's one kind of third of the alliance structure, not the structure, but the composition. A second key constituency are experts in security and biometrics. So established companies like RSA and Thales and groups like that, but also a lot of innovative, younger companies like Yubico and Knock Knock and Hyper, who are really, doing a lot of exciting, cool things in user authentication. And the last but not least, we have a cohort of companies that are service providers, whose businesses are dependent on their ability to deliver, high assurance services securely to billions of users each day. So these are the payments networks, companies like Visa, MasterCard, American Express, leading banks like Bank of America and Wells Fargo, and many Asian banks as well, service providers like Docomo and Verizon. These are companies whose businesses really depend on FIDO being successful. And collectively, these 3 groups contribute to FIDO's outputs. And our outputs, we do 3 things as an alliance. First, we create technical specifications for user authentication. Secondly, we run certification and interoperability tests against those specifications to make sure that there's an ecosystem of products that people can pick from to support their FIDO deployments. And the third thing we do is general kind of best practice enablement, market education about why and how to deploy FIDO authentication in a variety of settings.
That's really cool. So, obviously passwords, I think, and I think you would agree, it's the biggest problem that we have in cybersecurity. It's the cause of data breaches, data leaks. It's just kind of endless, just looking at the daily news, right? Another data breach happens.
Oh, yeah.
So what are some of your current initiatives at FIDO to help eliminate the need for passwords?
Well, I think, let's look at the password problem as you started to frame it just now. I mean, I think everyone understands that passwords are a problem, right? So oftentimes when I go speak places, or I used to go speak places, I start by asking, how many people like passwords? And there's always one joker in the back who says they do, but by and large, people understand this. It resonates with practitioners as consumers too, right? I mean, it's hard to go a day without having to face a password challenge or a reset or some sort of, we're trying to enter a password on a smart TV, whatever it might be. I think the average consumer understands the challenges of passwords. Where it gets a little bit more nuanced is tying those challenges back to the data breach plague that we talked about and other cybersecurity problems that are facing enterprises all over the world, right? So the vast majority of data breaches are caused by passwords, either by a password, having a weak password that opens access to sensitive resources, or passwords being left on a server, which leads to theft and reuse. Those are major problems. So what FIDO is trying to do is fundamentally shift the way that users authenticate. It's not just passwords. The core problem with passwords, aside from the usability issue, the core security problem with passwords, in my view, is that these are shared secrets that sit on a server. Right? Mm-hmm. Anything that's on a server can and eventually will be stolen. And if it's a password, that starts cranking up this cycle of credential theft, credential stuffing, credential reuse, which is self-perpetuating and terribly damaging. So we're trying to shift from this model of shared secrets on a server to one that allows users to authenticate locally to devices that they use every day using asymmetric public key cryptography. Now, asymmetric public key cryptography may be a mouthful for me to say or anyone to say, but what it really means is that we're creating a new concept called the authenticator, which is where a private key is stored locally on the device, and a public key, which is the counterpart to the private key, sits on the server. Right. So then as a user, once I go to authenticate, once I go to log in, whether it's on my phone or my laptop or using a security key, I activate this private key and it talks to the public key on the server, and then the authentication can really commence. Now, the key thing here is that public keys sitting on a server have no material value, right? So a hacker can't really do anything with a public key. And this is what we need to do. We need to break this credential theft cycle, this credential stuffing cycle, by getting rid of the credentials themselves. And that's what FIDO is trying to do, right? So it's a stepwise process. It's nothing that happens overnight. But as we've seen, large enterprises, large organizations deploy FIDO, their first step is to get people, off of passwords, and eventually they move to actually replace those passwords altogether, take them off the server, so there's no longer anything for hackers to steal. Now, one other point about this I want to highlight is that passwords by far are the most common type of shared secret, but anything that sits on servers are shared secrets, including other mechanisms for MFA, multi-factor authentication. Mm-hmm. So first and foremost, I'm thinking of SMS OTPs, one-time passcodes, right? A one-time passcode is still a shared secret. Now, it might be shared for a brief period of time, but it's sitting on a server, so a hacker can manipulate that and take advantage of that through relay attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, and things that can quite easily actually overcome your basic MFA. So it's very important to move beyond that model entirely with a better way of user authentication.
And now a word from our sponsor, Edgewise Networks. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved are flat networks in cloud and data centers, with unprotected attack paths that allow threats to move laterally to cause data breaches. But microsegmentation using network addresses is complicated and takes too much time. But there's a better approach: Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation, delivering results immediately with a security outcome that's provable. At the core of Edgewise Auto Segmentation is Zero Trust Identity, which allows workloads to communicate only after their software identity has been verified. Malicious or unimproved software is no longer allowed to communicate. Identity-based protection provides more coverage with fewer policies to make Edgewise simple to deploy and manage. No changes to the application or network are required. One solution protects virtual machines and containers in the cloud and on-premises. To stop lateral threat movement and prevent breaches, visit edgewise.net for a demo and to see results within minutes. So what vendors right now are supporting the things that FIDO is using? I know for one Windows Hello, right, through Microsoft. That's already one that I know I use, and some others I'm sure are familiar with. What other vendors right now that people would be familiar with are using your standards?
Yeah. So, I mentioned at the outset, FIDO does three things. The second one being interoperability and certification testing. That's a really important part of what FIDO does is build this ecosystem of products and services out there. Standards by themselves are it's like building half a bridge, right? You need to make sure that products can work for the whole thing to be complete. So we have over 600 FIDO certified products on market. The key thing that happened in 2019 was support by the platform, right? So you already referenced Microsoft. So Microsoft, Windows 10 or Windows Hello is now a FIDO certified platform, meaning that any Windows 10 PC has FIDO capabilities. The other key milestone last year was Android becoming a FIDO certified platform as well. So any Android 7 or later device, which is the majority of Android handsets and devices in market, is also a FIDO certified authenticator. So that means on either one of these, right? If the service provider supports it, you can now start, using your biometric or a local authenticator instead of a password to authenticate to websites and web services, which is really exciting, right? So I use a Lenovo laptop. I use Windows Hello every day to log on to my services. Likewise, I have a Pixel phone. When I go to eBay, for example, if I go to ebay.com on the mobile web, I can actually use a local biometric on my Pixel to log in rather than my password. And the list of implementations goes on, and it's becoming more and more prevalent every day. So I think those are two major, examples of platforms that support FIDO. But beyond that, most IAM companies have either implicit or explicit support for FIDO. Some of the vendors I mentioned before, who have like Yubico, is really helped drive this category of security keys, with many other companies in that space like Paytien, EWBM, and many, many more, bringing keys to market. So it's, really the ecosystem of supporting products and services is growing as the demand for FIDO authentication grows as well.
So I know there's two standards that that our listeners might hear about that probably want to understand what is this, and that's FIDO2 and WebAuthn. Could you maybe give a simplistic overview of what those two standards are and maybe how they relate to the devices that we use?
Yeah, let me keep it simple. Let me back up first to talk about FIDO specs in general. Mm-hmm. So a little historical perspective, I think, will help frame this better. So, I mentioned FIDO was launched publicly in 2013. FIDO was launched to focus on two key authentication use cases. One was a biometric, basically password re-authentication use case. In fact, the very first FIDO implementation was done by PayPal in conjunction with Samsung on the Galaxy, I think S5, the first Galaxy handset to have biometrics. And the goal there, when PayPal first started looking at this, they said, this is interesting, but it's going to be far more interesting if there's a whole ecosystem of products that support this, right? And so that the concept there was basically using, again, public key cryptography to enable local authentication using biometric. So that was what's called FIDO UAF, or FIDO Universal Authentication Framework. A second use case was launched around the same time called focus on a second factor, so a password supplement, using security keys as to prove possession of the device as a second factor authentication, called FIDO U2F. And this is universal second factor, and this was popularized in security keys like YubiKeys and implemented first by, say, Google, as a second factor on top of Google services. Both two of these frameworks, both UAF and U2F, both have the universal kind of FIDO goodness underneath them of strong privacy principles, privacy protections, and they're all based on public key cryptography, right? So this was great. So from 2013, 2014, 2015, FIDO was seeing good, initial adoption of both specifications, some really strong early adopters with leading brands worldwide. What FIDO realized, though, is to really gain scale, to really have the ubiquity we need as an industry to move beyond passwords, we had to target the platforms and the web itself as a platform. And that's where FIDO launched something called the FIDO 2.0 web APIs, which, to FIDO's credit, realized that to gain real standardization of this, we should contribute this to the web standardization body itself, the W3C. And so that's what we did. So we contributed these APIs to W3C. It became the Web Authentication Working Group, or WebAuthn. So in short, what WebAuthn does, it's a server-side implementation that allows websites and web servers to deploy strong FIDO authentication to their users. FIDO2 is kind of a marketing umbrella term that includes both WebAuthn, as well as a corresponding protocol from FIDO called CTAP, Client to Authenticator Protocol, which extends the U2F paradigm to allow, both carry on that lineage of second factor devices, but also allows for your handset to serve as an authenticator to your PC. So that's CTAP. So FIDO2 is those two things. So I guess it's not a very simple explanation, but let me back it up and try to be simple about it. The FIDO2 is what enables websites to very easily deploy FIDO authentication to end users. And likewise, when you see a FIDO2 certified device, whether it's a platform or a handset or a security key, that's what allows consumers to leverage that functionality when they at point of login.
Awesome. So from a vendor perspective, are you seeing a lot of traction, and is this getting, the things that you guys are working on, is this becoming more adoptable across the industry?
Yeah, I think so. And we talked, earlier about the, important developments last year of the two major platforms, supporting FIDO. So I talked about Microsoft, I talked about Windows, talked about Android, but we didn't talk about the web yet, right? And so that's another really key component here, especially with WebAuthn, being the delivery vehicle for FIDO authentication. So very important is that all the leading web browsers also support FIDO. So if you're on any browser, essentially, it supports FIDO. And with any new technology, there's always this kind of chicken and egg, scenario where you need to get the addressable market in place for the service providers to want to target that market. And so now we have that market in place, and we're seeing more and more companies, ramping up their deployment plans to fulfill this. So, on our website, we have some case studies from groups like Intuit, Entity Docomo, the U.S. government. It's huge in parts of Korea and China and Asia. We have many case studies of examples of people already deploying FIDO. And as you can imagine, there's many, many more who don't really want to publicly talk about it quite yet. Yeah. So yes, I think the vendor community continues to grow based on market demand for deployment of FIDO.
That's great. So my ultimate question to you is, when would we give the official death notice to passwords? Is this something we'll see in the next couple months, couple years? What's your prediction here?
Well, a couple of months would be terribly ambitious. A couple of years. So here's a hot take though. Let's, I like to kind of put things in perspective. Mm-hmm. Look, not every password can or will be replaced. If you look at that enterprise, these legacy systems and these old enterprises, you have companies who are still running on tape drives, right? Oh, yeah. So they have priorities that they need to look at beyond, passwords, at least on that part of their infrastructure. And there's other ways to protect those kind of old things. But as you get closer and closer to the front end, to the user, yes, absolutely. I think you'll see two key things in the next couple of years. One, inside the enterprise, you'll see a scaled and kind of growing rapid shift towards going passwordless inside the enterprise, and that's going to be ushered in, I think, a lot by the work that Microsoft's doing to support passwordless authentication, including FIDO authentication, through Windows Hello, Azure AD. Makes it easier and easier for companies to actually support passwordless. And beyond Microsoft, we have so many vendors who are working to help people deploy in heterogeneous environments as well. Because ultimately, the market driver there inside the enterprise is the risk and the cost associated with password management, right? Password resets cost money, they cost time, there's productivity loss, and the threat of someone getting phished and spear phished, which continues to be on the rise, is a very clear and present threat. So there's an imperative to move beyond passwords inside the enterprise, and there's now technology to make that happen. So I think that combination is perfect for making this a reality over the next couple of years. So I'd say in the next 5 to 7 years, absolutely, you'll see more enterprises embracing passwordless.
Very cool. Yeah, that seems.
As we talk about consumer services, right? So your leading internet services, I would be happy to say that I think the next 5 years, you'll see the vast majority of those, of the leading, the top 100 internet services, consumer-facing services. I think the vast majority, 90+% of those will have passwordless options in the next 5 years. And I would think that most of those will be supporting FIDO authentication.
So what advice would you have for our listeners on how they can start eliminating passwords from their lives?
Well, it depends where they sit, so if you're inside an enterprise or if you're a CISO, I'd ask your vendors how to help implement this, for your employees. If you're an employee at a company and they allow you to have some flexibility in how you authenticate, I look at some of the security keys on market. I look at leveraging Windows Hello if you have a Windows desktop. If you use Google services, look at Google Advanced Protection, both as an employee or as an individual user. Google Advanced Protection is the strongest protection on market against phishing because it's dependent on FIDO authentication, right? So you can use it with a security key, either a physical key or your phone. So these are tools that are in place today to allow you to start going passwordless. In general, I'd encourage, beyond just going passwordless, I'd encourage all users to use multi-factor authentication immediately, right? Even SMS OTP, which is, terribly flawed, still
better.
Eliminates around 98% of scalable hacking attempts. So do that first, then focus, immediately thereafter on getting beyond SMS OTP and pushing your service providers to support, true passwordless user authentication with FIDO.
Well, this is great stuff, Andrew. How can our listeners find out more about you and the FIDO Alliance?
I'd say visit our website. So we have two things happening. One, go to FIDOalliance.org. You can follow FIDO Alliance on Twitter and LinkedIn as well. Also, we'll be launching very soon some consumer-facing assets on a website called loginwithfido.com, which will be targeted more consumers to educate them on how to leverage FIDO authentication, how it works, and also helps educate service providers on some of the value propositions that FIDO.
Excellent. We'll have all that linked in our show notes for our listeners. But thanks again for coming on the show, Andrew. It's a great conversation, and I appreciate your time.
Super, Tom. Thanks so much.